Now, Dr. Pali Lehohla, the former statistician-general, has written an opinion piece on the state of affairs of governance. He says bad policies drive the poor into further despair and that South Africans have been facing one crisis after another, leading to the popular saying, South Africans are resilient. For more on this, we are joined now by Dr. Pali Lehohla, the former statistician-general of South Africa. Very good afternoon to you, Dr. Lehohla. Thank you for your time. In your opinion piece, you're essentially saying enough of the often used South Africa's resilient line. It's tired and lends us to abuse by politicians.
Yes, indeed. I mean, it's a popular line that South Africans are resilient. You can't be told that you are resilient when you are hungry. And for that, you are being told by somebody whose stomach is full. Resilience is about unity. Resilience is about common cause. Resilience is about common purpose. There isn't a common purpose between the rich and the poor in South Africa. The rich have their private security. The rich have their private schools. The rich have their private electricity, while the poor remain poor. Therefore, it is a tired statement. It is ideologically barren to discuss about South Africa being resilient. One can believe that South Africa has been resilient against a common enemy called apartheid. And no one in the apartheid state ever said South Africans, and particularly black South Africans, are resilient. They wouldn't say so because they knew that we are truly resilient. But the ruling class, the ruling elite, want to use that tired word, and the bourgeois wants to use that tired word to put palliatives and blunt South Africans suffering by promising them religious statements that they are resilient. There's no resilience. People have been abused so much that whatever resilience remains in them, it has dissipated. So I find that very offending, especially when it is stated by the bourgeois and quoting very preposterous example of how that resilience is displayed. We can't be called resilient when energy has been destroyed in the way it has been, deliberate, sending people to go and collect firewood. And once you go and use firewood or coal in your stove, then you are worse off in terms of climate damaging emissions to the climate than before when you had electricity. At least the energy in the house was clean, even though the skies were polluted. But this time around, the skies and the lungs are polluted at the same time.
Yeah.
And this is where we find ourselves. And the statement that says we are resilient should be told to somebody else, not the poor.
Yeah, because the evidence says poverty is spreading and deepening, especially exacerbated by the effects of COVID-19. Of course, load shedding being a massive factor as we speak. And we're also learning of another interest rate hike that is expected. We are hearing that it could be the last for the year, but it doesn't make things any better. How then do South Africans claim back their power?
Whether interest is high or interest is low, interest rate multiplied by zero still remains zero. And the majority of the people are in that zero area where there is no income. So the situation is so dire that certain words have to be outside the vocabulary. We need empathy. And resilience is not a word that can be used for empathy by people who have brought us to
Do you think that
where we are today in South Africa,
yeah.
where there is no electricity. And to be told that we are resilient, I penned that article because there was a lady who is part of the risk assessment managers, Mrs. Cummings, who are saying we are resilient because there are a few blacks who are buying shares. That's very patronizing. The game is rigged from onset, and you cannot use a few blacks who go through the door and make it and say that we are resilient. That's a serious generalization when everything is going south, particularly for the majority.
So with these significantly deteriorating conditions brought by bad policy, especially showing in how poor people are mostly affected, How then do we begin to rework the policy? Is it a matter of really bad policy or the implementation of good policy?
Well, a good policy doesn't need to explain itself. So it will result in good results. It's not a matter of implementation, but when you don't have a policy and hope that you can always draw a policy on the back of the cigarette box, then you have bad policy. It doesn't matter how much you try to implement that, it will always remain bad. So let's forget about that we have good policies. We may have good intentions, and translating those intentions into policies is hard work. It requires empathy, it requires skills, it requires precision of execution. But under the circumstances, there is no empathy. So the good intentions are false because they have to be tested by execution of good policies. There are no good policies in South Africa, there are good intentions. A policy to be good has three characteristics. It must be tested for robustness, it must be tested for future-proof, and it must be admissible to the general populace. So these policies have not been tested for robustness, they don't have future-proof, and whether they are popularly accepted by the populace is another thing. So there is no good policy. There are good intentions, and those are different from policies.
How much do you think South Africa's corruption and lack of accountability has perhaps increased the risks themselves?
Well, fundamentally is that the policies that we have designed are crafted and based on the Monflair scenarios. And the Monflair scenarios had three conditions. The promise of the Monflair scenarios, which were proposed by Shell and presented to Cabinet in 1993, promised an inclusive democracy and inclusive growth. We know that the democracy is inclusive, but growth is not inclusive, and development is not inclusive. So the Monflair scenarios that we are still on course on now are not yielding what the promise should have been. They said, first, will the transition occur? The transition occurred. Will the transition be fast? The transition was very fast. President Mandela was virtually a president long before he became president, in particular upon the death of Prison and assassination of Prison. He literally established the date of the election. The last was, are the macroeconomic policies populist? Obviously, we went on the Washington consensus and imposed our own structural reforms. At the end of that 4-year period, growth was not inclusive. Now we are back to that stage where growth is not inclusive, although democracy is inclusive. It means that the policies that we have adopted that do not generate inclusive growth and development for that matter, then are bad policies. And we are refusing to get those policies and actually put them aside and go for different policies. To that extent, corruption is not only corruption because there is corruption, but it is a consequence of those very bad policies.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Pali Lehohla, former statistician-general of South Africa. We're going to have to leave it there for now. Thanking you for your time. And, of course, the line not sounding too good right towards the end there.